I'm delighted to welcome the panel to come up and sit along in these seats here. We've got Róísín, we've got Danny, we've got David, and we've got Junior. You can work out which is who and read the bios. But what you have got there is you've got a wealth of perspectives, of background, of roles, and that's what we're going to delve into today. So we haven't asked them to do their 5 minutes each because that just eats up the time, and we want to maximise your questions. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, but get ready to pose your questions too. So we've heard a lot about courage and risk, how brave we can be this morning. One of the things that makes a huge difference, of course, is the culture that we all create in our organisations and wider, isn't it? So I'd like to start by asking each of the panel, I'll perhaps start with you, Danny, if you don't mind, to reflect on your own experiences and talk about perhaps examples of where you've been able to create space for courageous leadership, or maybe get someone else to do that for you. Can you say a little bit about how we create culture in that way?
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here and great to be in person and great to be amongst people, put together. The people in this room have tremendous power to do the sorts of things that we've just heard about, and I think we do owe it to ourselves to be courageous. In my experience, courage starts with being open to sort of check your own privilege and to not assume that the power you hold, is somehow some sort of entitlement that you've won. And I feel incredibly privileged to have served in the various roles I have, including as a trustee of several trusts and foundations over the years. And there is an allure to that, right? There's a sort of allure that somehow, you're giving away millions and, therefore you've earned that right somehow. Whereas I've always felt that it's privileged, it's luck in some ways I happen to hold those posts. And so I think being conscious of one's own power and privilege is the starting point for the sort of courage that we all need.
Great, thank you very much. Junior.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. For me, courageous leadership was actually being able to create an ethos within SOS. I've got to tell you something about SOS. So
yeah,
SOS is completely ex-offender led. So by virtue, we're dealing with people that have had, experienced multiple complex needs. They genuinely don't see themselves in leadership roles. That would probably be the last thing they've probably they've had negative experiences with the law, probably they've experienced they've got complex negative backgrounds. And here I am with this project, and I wanted to create an ethos of it being like a family. So every year we sit down, we share a meal together. I've got very much a hands-on role with the project. This is almost 20 years on, and one of the most important things that I embraced was actually letting go of the reins. I saw so many people wanting to be the person that's out there, wanting to have the name, have the title, have the privilege, have the prestige, and I was just like, nah. I'd rather have my startup, and one of my biggest successes is having staff that are actually able to see themselves as leaders, not only within the organisation, but within for some of them, they're the first ones that have actually achieved staff. I think about one of my workers who's actually about to leave. She's gotten a job, and she's moving on to bigger and better things. And I remember having a conversation with her. Her name's CJ. And I was saying to her, the most important thing that can possibly ever happen is that I trust what you're doing implicitly, and then you can just go off and take the reins and develop and innovate, because that's how I got to where I was. Like, people allowed me to go off, and many times they were probably gritting their teeth, what's he going to say, what's he going to do? But it all worked out because I cared inherently about the subject that we're dealing with, which is young people and violence. And so, for me, giving leadership away, I think, is really, really important. And that's, for me, that not only takes courage, but also it's very liberating. And it gets you to see things because for any one problem, there's multiple ways of looking at it. And if you can encourage your staff and be courageous in that sense and get them to be courageous, then they come back and they feed you what's really happening on the ground, and that enriches what you're able to offer. And that for me is courageous leadership.
Thank you very much, Julia. And that really speaks to what, it was so interesting, wasn't it, in the polling, how many of you talked about systemic inequalities. It's really, if I think back over the years I've come to this conference, I think that's something that's really changed. So it's great to hear a bit more about that. Róísín, what can you tell us about making space for courageous leadership and changing culture?
I mean, for me, I think when I think about courage, it's such a personal thing, what we define as courage. But to me, I always think humility sits at the centre of courage. And I worked in football for a long time, so you don't use the word humility in football because they don't normally go together. So they don't see that as a strength, whereas I see it as an absolute strength, because that gives you that ability to empathise, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to be humble enough to know what you don't know and to be open to learning, because I'm always trying to make sure that's what we are. I think for us too, I think it's about resilience. I think I've worked in the sector a long time, both as a CEO of Kick It Out and now as a community foundation. And that resilience is what we need every single day, because we are pushed. It's a challenging time. It remains challenging time. I think for us to be courageous, we need to accept the fact that we need resilience built into what we do. And I think for me, as a CEO, both of Kick It Out and of the Community Foundation for Northern Ireland, and I thought Lucy is a much better speaker than me, she said it properly, it's that ability to be vulnerable and to say, you know, it's as if mental health can impact everybody else, but it can't impact me as a CEO. Well, sorry, I have mental health issues, I manage them, I have to be vulnerable and open about that, and to be really clear that leaders also have mental health issues. It doesn't cut us out of the whole equation. But I think what I thought was great also about Lucy, so I'm bigging you up there, Lucy, but I think that red card or that wild card or whatever you want to use, I think in Kick It Out, I think I made a mistake, which a lot of people make in campaigners, is when we had events, people who came were people who were interested in anti-racism or anti-homophobia or Islamophobia. That wasn't who we were supposed to be reaching. It was the people who weren't interested. So it's how do we reach the people who don't come to our events, who don't share our views? How do we reach out to them? How do we be courageous about having discussions with people that are politically or ideologically completely different than we are? And what does that mean for us? Because that's a challenge for me as being a well-known and thought, as I think, an anti-racist campaigner, to sit opposite people who are basically fundamentally racist or misogynistic or homophobic or Islamophobic, whatever it is, and how do we change their behaviour? How do I try to understand their behaviour that makes me try to work out why do you do the things you do, why do you feel the ways you feel, and how can I help to change that? And that's a difficult conversation because it's nice, and it's the same with the pandemic, and I'm going to stop sitting in rooms where we all tell each other how horrible it is and how awful it is, because it is, and I accept that. But I'm interested now in how do we change? What can we do that's creative? How can we work together? Because if not, we're all going to sit around the room going, it's terrible, it's terrible, it was terrible last month, it's terrible next month, but even worse the month after that. Next year's going to be even worse, so we may as well just give up. And I think that's the same with climate. When you talk to people about either DEI work or climate work, it's too much. They're sort of overcome and overwhelmed by it all, and we have to break it down. We have to look at steps that we bring people with us. So I think for me, that's about trying to be that courageous leader who has to be really uncomfortable and really sit in that uncomfortable space where you're going, I'm not totally sure, but I'm just going to stay here till I get to the end of it. Sometimes it's just the resilience of staying.
No, here. Thank you, Róísín. And David, I think you've been in your role for about a year at National Lottery Community Foundation. What have you seen in that year that is around courageous leadership?
Yeah, I mean, it's a delight to be here to talk about this morning. And with courage, so powerful, isn't it? And it's very personal. And we've all spoken about that this morning, haven't we? And I suppose I slightly reflect, what does it not mean for me too as well? And I think there's perhaps a danger with a word like courage that takes us into very sort of personality-driven, even kind of quite heroic leadership. And we've probably all seen in this room the sort of burnout we heard about earlier from Lucy, or felt it ourselves or experienced it. And I suppose there's three things I would particularly reflect on, and echoing some of the themes. So one is about the courage of authenticity, of being actually clear about our own values, being willing to speak, talk about them, to be humble, to listen, learn and reflect from others. I think there's a really second thing about, for me, how we create spaces for others. There are times in the National Lottery Community Fund, we're a large community funder UK-wide, where actually we can take risk, we can convene, we can create spaces for people. There's also times when we need to step away and give those spaces to other people, bring people with lived experience, support participatory grant making. And I think the third thing I'd really say just about courage and leadership is the unique thing you have as a leader is being able to see the system you're operating in, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. And I think we've heard already people talk about that, to challenge that system and to think about your responsibility in driving that change within the system in which we all operate.
Great, thank you very much. Really interesting start to this discussion. And one of the things we've heard throughout this, and actually throughout the morning, is about allyship. And I guess question for me is about, as foundations, you know, what does good allyship look like? How is it that we get out of the way when we need to, and amplify other people's voices, and make space for those? And when do we need to use our voice? And I wonder if we could start with you, Junior, if there's anything you'd be able to say about that. How do we make space for other voices and decide when we, as foundations, when we use our voices?
Okay, wow, that's a really...
Sorry, hard question.
It's a really, really good question. When I think about allyship, I think about people that stand behind you and will advocate your cause. I think about people that will open doors for you. I think about the soft, I know foundations probably think purely in monetary terms, but actually some of the soft outcomes is really, really important. So let me just start there. So I, in addition to SOS, one of the things that I do, unfortunately, is where young people have been murdered, often families try to set up charities or foundations. Yeah. And I've been really fortunate because, you know, St Giles is a charity and that could deviate our own. So it's part of what I do, partly because I engage with the families, and they are disaffected. You know, many of the families that get in touch with us, I ask them, who's been in touch with you? And they'll say, no one, and I'm not even an MP. No, I've just had to deal with it on my own, and it's absolutely shocking. And one of the things that you have there is real, powerful motivation, but they lack the means. And so when it comes to things, so they lack the ability, so one of the things that we know is crucially important is monitoring and evaluation. Trust me, as a project, we learnt the hard way how important that is to monitor. And not only that, to be able to prove to funders, but imagine a startup, they just don't have that. Imagine the networks that exist. So one of the mentors that I had early on, the most important thing that he gave us wasn't actually money, but introduction to networks that we just wouldn't have access to. We're not a fluffy project. We're dealing with violence. We're dealing with stuff that is probably the last thing on people's minds, and the rhetoric and the stereotypes and the misinformation out there about young people is really, really damaging. It's a wonder that many young people succeed the way they do. And so, for him, it was about opening the network, standing behind us and saying to everybody else, well, no, I believe in this guy. I believe in what he's trying to do. And that just enabled us to springboard ourselves. And then he started to show us some of the means to get there. And this was all before a penny had even been given to us. And it just gave us strength and longevity. And my gosh, you know what makes me really sad is I have struggled to repeat that for the families I've supported, because there's so many foundations, there's so many children being murdered, there's so much going on. And unfortunately, that's the last thing on most people's lists. So yeah, allyship is all about that, and it's about getting behind. I think it came up on the board earlier, helping people campaign. So yeah, I've actually been shut down a little bit, but in the larger arena, because some of the stuff that I've been saying is against charitable thinking. So, you know, we're supposed to be non-partisan, we're not supposed to challenge the government because, you know, we could get money from the government. We're not supposed to challenge the police because, you know, we could get money from the police. But I'm sorry, when you're motivated the way I am, when you see something is wrong, you have to speak. It's against the law to have a platform and not use it against the stuff that you're seeing. And so when I've spoken out, it's like, oh, your wings, we're going to clip your wings. And I think in one case, it's backfired because one of the organisations that's just to say a social media company has given it to all of our competitors except for us. And although it hasn't been said, you know, but I am a very outspoken, I'm not like, yeah, let's smite the social media companies, that's not what I'm saying. But I am saying, where is your accountability for the young people that are using your platform and is encouraging violence? And yeah, so that's a real powerful, if that's a good enough example I can use, but that's kind of what I see.
Great, thank you. And Danny, I wonder if we could come to you, because Oxfam's recently signed up to the Pledge for Change, hasn't it? So this is about creating closer partnerships with community organisations and devolving power and decision-making for them. What would you say about the role of foundations in supporting that kind of initiative?
Well, I think foundations, or anyone who claims to be supporting civil society, particularly in the Global South, have a hugely important role to play. And that is my sort of number one frustration, I suppose, about private philanthropy, which is, you know, in some ways, this could be the most radical of sectors. You could be the most radical of actors. You have private funds in a large part, many of these foundations are endowed. You have freedoms to take the long view, to take risks. But yet, it is also a sector that often shows up as deeply conservative or complacent, that, you know, where participatory grant making, as was just said, is seen as a sort of cutting edge way of devolving power. You know, we should never have got ourselves into a position where we think involving our grantees and the people we claim to support in the decision making and systems within our own organization is somehow innovation. That should be fundamental to what we do. And so for those of us in the development sector, you know, where the bigger NGOs in some ways act like grant makers. And Oxfam in Great Britain raises net about £100 million a year from our individual fundraising and from our shops. So in some ways we are a philanthropy in the development sector. And what we've come to realize is we've become part of the problem, that we've held on to power, that we don't genuinely devolve decision-making to the communities and partners we claim to be serving. And so something called the Pledge for Change is a pledge that was only launched a few weeks ago by a few, I think about 7 initial signatories. All of us are large international civil society networks. And our pledge is to both tell stories in a different way that doesn't fall prey to a sort of patronizing, paternalistic view of the Global South in particular, but also of anyone who we claim to be working with. And the second part is to get fundamentally better at shifting power and resources to the partners and communities we work with. And I think it is, you know, gone are the days when you can sort of sit back and say, our job is just to, you know, spend money as wisely as possible, because the how matters hugely. And I think there are some interesting parallels there between sort of private philanthropy and anyone, including large INGOs, who hold relatively more resources in a resource-strapped ecosystem.
Thank you, Danny. Róísín, you, very interesting, we were chatting before the session this morning about the context in Northern Ireland, which is obviously different to what many of us face and particularly challenging at the moment. Are there any lessons you could share with us there around how you and colleagues there have supported inclusion and in the way that we've been hearing about? Anything we can learn from that could be applied? Sorry, lots of difficult questions.
I mean, whether or not you agree with the government here or not, at least you've got one.
Well,
so, you know, we're still, I'm sure we're going to have, I was saying earlier, and we're going to have another election, which we pretty much sure will say exactly what the last election said. So, and that's therein lies madness. I think for us, I think, just to reiterate both Junior and Danny's comments, I think for us, I feel very strongly that we have such a role and influence in government policy once we get one, that we have to, as a foundation, not just be an ethical investor on how we use our endowment, but we need to really, really, really influence government, and we need to influence ourselves, each other as funders, about how we fund, because I think that's critical at the moment when we talk about inclusion and we talk about what that means. Now, we've funded the Peace Impact Programme and Peace for a long time in Northern Ireland, and that means taking quite high risk funding groups that wouldn't necessarily be the sort of ones who come to the table early. This is really grassroots, quite challenging, quite difficult, sort of quite quiet sort of levels of funding, because they are the people that are making the difference in Northern Ireland. But I think for me, and we're just about to appoint, we've just gone through strategic review and we're about to appoint, hopefully, a new director of policy. I think that idea of what policy means and how we influence is critical for us now as foundations, and I can only speak for us in Northern Ireland, is how do we influence government? Most of the sector is funded through government in Northern Ireland. They do not fund the way the sector needs them to fund. They do not fund the things that the sector wants them to fund. The whole transparency, longer, we all know this, core unrestricted funding, which is what the sector wants and needs. That trust-based funding, that's relationship, not transactional funding, is what the sector tells us all the time. And yet we keep on saying, well, I know, but we're just going to fund it this way because of power. And we've got to stop doing that. We've got to work together as foundations in this room and outside it to influence how we ourselves fund, how we influence the government to fund, how we influence philanthropy to fund, because that's, I think our voice is so strong and we have such validity to our voice and such integrity to our voice because we know what the sector needs because they tell us all the time. So if we're going to be truly inclusive, if we're really going to shift the power away, then we have to really think in that way and we have to listen to what the sector needs and we need to take risks. And sometimes it's difficult for our boards, I accept that. I'm on a board, we're not particularly engaging with the risk, but we have to, and that will involve failure. But it's about learning from the failure, and I think for our board, it's really clear that their appetite is about that because we see what's ahead of us. We all know in this room that the next 2 or 3 years will be challenging, not only for us as foundations, and we've got that buffer, but for the sector. For the sectors we work, we know exactly what it said, we know people won't survive it, and so we have to work out what's the best use, how do we get the funds through the door. We did it through the pandemic. I said this to one of the ministers in Northern Ireland, nobody ran away with the money. Yeah. Nobody ran away with it, guys, so stop defaulting back to what's safe. Well, you need to fill in this 20-page form for the £3,000 grant. No, you don't. No, you don't need to do that. You know, we need to be brave. We need to stand, all of us in this room, and stand and go, stop funding that way because it doesn't work.
Brilliant. Thank you, Róísín. I'm going to ask David a question in a minute, which is follows on from that really, about the balance between risk and accountability. And then I'm going to come to you because I'm conscious I've monopolised this wonderful panel and you will all have questions you want to ask. So there will be people with microphones. So once we've heard from David, do stick your hand up and we'll take 3 at a time. So David, I mean, you obviously run a very large fund and you and your board and colleagues will be thoughtful about how you approach risk in that context, how you do encourage the courage and the bravery and how you balance that with accountability for public money. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, brilliant question. And I mean, as a national lottery community fund, we have a lot of accountability. Essentially, Parliament established a national lottery on the same principles as public money. That means we're accountable to Parliament, accountable to actually 5 governments. I've got more than 40, nearly 50 non-executives in committees across the community fund. We're giving a grant every 7 minutes. So I think there's a lot of accountability to that, ultimately to national lottery players who, you know, it's thanks to national lottery players who are able to do the remarkable work that's made possible inside communities. I mean, how do we then balance that with risk? I mean, my own hunch and experience is we often perhaps sort of overstate risk, but underplay the importance of being really attentive to risk and really thinking about risk in a broader way, strategic risks as well as operational and communications risks. And I think the more you attend to it in a deliberate way, think about it as an engineer as well as an architect in a system that you're working in, the more that you can take some risk. So just to give an example, in the community fund over the last year, we've brought in somebody at a very senior level to work on risk. And that might seem like it might have a chilling effect, right? So are we going to trap ourselves into conversations about operational risk? Are we going to bureaucratize our systems? Actually, what that's enabled us to do is sort of enable and unleash the system to be really clear about our risks, where we're treating them, where we're tolerating them, where we're trying to transfer them. But the last T being take the opportunity, right? Because if you don't take the opportunity for risk, then you're ultimately failing the people that you're here to serve. And we've seen that. I think in everyone's organisations, we've had to take a kind of completely rip up some of our rules. Actually, we've had to completely change our rules during COVID. Now with cost of living again, we're using our core funding principles, staying true to those, but actually changing our control frameworks, changing how we vary our grant policies in a way that is much more tolerant of the risk, but it's only by really attending to it we've been able to do that.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. Right, it's your turn. Please put your hand up if you have a question that you'd like to ask. So I can see one right at the back in the middle. There's a microphone coming to you. I can see one on the other side. Yep, just there. And I can see one, the man in the middle. Yes, just there. Let's take those three. And if you could say who you are and where you're from and keep your questions as concise as you possibly can, that would be amazing. So let's start with you. Yeah.
Oh. Hi, I'm Chloe Gagan from the Jabs Foundation. I'm probably going to be unpopular with 73 people in the room, but I wanted to get the panel's takes on the polling we did earlier around whether systems change can actually be defined as courage, or is that not just our jobs? Is that not the bare minimum, to Danny's point earlier, around participatory grant making not being revolutionary, but what we should be doing? Because I was pretty shocked by that, because to me that isn't courageous, that's just our jobs. And we have an opportunity today to really talk about the things that matter and the hard conversations. And that doesn't feel hard to me, that just feels like our jobs. So I would like for all of you, if you could really talk about one hard issue today and what we all should be doing to kind of get ourselves out of business, which should be our job, what would it be?
Great question, thank you very much.
Hi, Emily Crawford from Glasspool Charity Trust. This is perhaps aimed particularly at Róísín and Danny. You talked a lot about delegating, devolving down, grant making, and that's very much about, Danny, in fact, I think you said this, about the how of grant making. What I wondered if you could elaborate on is, in that context, how do you ensure that what you're funding achieves the end goals? And Róísín, you talked about trust-based funding, which, absolutely sounds amazing. In those circumstances, what are you looking for in a grant recipient, either as an individual or as an organisation, when you're not funding a specific item or task or community centre, but you're funding on a relationship? What are your selection criteria? How do you ensure what you're funding is going to get where you want to go?
Great, thank you very much. And the final question here.
Good morning, Jim McCormick from the Robertson Trust. I wanted to ask about our role in setting the tone and being very mindful about the words we use, the metaphors we use, and the visions we set. I'm struck by the power of reframing when we get it right. It's the difference between accepting poverty is here to stay, or we've got destitution in the UK, and using frames that talk about, of course we can solve these things. We were closer to doing it some years ago, and our neighbours are closer to doing it now. And the power of our grant making and our partnerships demonstrate the possibility of doing this faster. So I wonder to what extent you are using methods of reframing that get us out of our current paradigm of failure, demand, and so on, and into hopeful solutions that are here and now to be built.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. Another great question. So I'm going to ask you all first to address that last question, which is about reframing, while that's in your minds. And then I'll come to Danny and Róísín in particular to pick up the middle question, which was about the what and how that achieves our goals. And then perhaps we'll come back to everyone for a hard issue and how we might tackle that. So just a reminder, let's start with Jim's question about how we reframe and the tone we use and the words we use and how that all matters. Can we start with you, Danny, and work along on that one?
Yeah, I think words and framings do matter, and I was mentioning the Pledge for Change. Well, a fundamental aim there is to move away from a sort of paternalistic or patronizing form of philanthropy towards one of mutuality, of solidarity, and that's really important for organisations like ours because we have millions of people in the UK who support us, who donate to us, who volunteer in our shop. And we feel that our aspiration is to be a movement of people against poverty. And you can't do that if you start to use frames that are themselves harmful because they are paternalistic or patronizing. So I think that's really important. Let me stop there and I'll come back to the end.
Great. Junior?
I was really enjoying what you were having to say there.
Me too.
Reframing is a huge thing within our arena because it happens all through it. So when we talk about exploitation of girls and women, we talk about gang members. Like, believe it or not, gangs was never part of SOS's title. I know it is up there, but that was the media. The media stuck with the label of gangs, and somehow it just fitted in with it. That the whole reframing of the issue, reframing of what we're dealing with and how important it is to actually get rid of it. Last year summer, I actually had an argument with another charity because that they were saying that the ideas I was putting on the table was too radical. And believe it or not, they actually said if we followed through with your ideas, we'd cannibalise our own business. There'd be no reason for us to exist. And I was like, but that's the whole point of what? Do you know, it was so bizarre to hear somebody else say that. And it really hit me in terms of there are some people in this arena that are there with their own agendas. And actually, it's better if it's business as usual. I personally don't want to live in a world where young people can kill each other and murder each other. I've had enough of seeing newspaper headlines where that is happening. So it's really important about what we reframe, what we're trying to achieve, and really measuring that. The last thing I wanted to mention is, because in my field, the language of lived experience is a big one, So in the time that we've been running the project, they've gone from being ex-offenders, those with convictions, to lived experience, and it all means exactly the same thing. And actually, we need to move past that. Personally, like I was mentioning about my female member of staff who's leaving us shortly, I personally don't want them to have any of those titles. For me, a win is if they're seen as experts in the field, and if they're in the most incredible place that anyone with lived experience or service user experience can have is not even in the co-production, but in the production of services. Yeah, we have. Okay, all right. Do you understand where I'm coming? I will get off my soapbox in a minute.
Great point.
Because at the moment, it's still too much of, we're going in, we're going to do this, we're going to make things better, and nobody's listening to the people that are on the receiving end of this. Nobody understands the problem more inherently than the people we're trying to reach. So yeah, we need to move past all of that, and actually, let's get them in the driving seat. Let's talk, and I'm not talking about, let's just go crazy. I know some people had that idea when I came out, and it was about, okay, Junior's going to run this project and stuff. You can have, the bouncers that you have at when you're playing bowling or something, that stops you going too far off because you can get drawn into this rabbit hole, but keeps you on track. And that's what we need when we're talking about the production and the creation of new services, because that's what the lifeblood of the charity sector and the foundation sector will be, knowing what the next problems are.
great. Thank you very much, Junior. Róísín, anything on framing you wanted to add?
Well, it's funny because we've just literally gone through a strategic review and we've just reframed our mission, and that's now working hand in hand with communities. And that's because that's what I think, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be over here sitting going, you poor people over there, let us help you. But it's funny, when we talk to our grantee network as part of this, the phrase that they use, and the phrase that I love, is they said, we need you to be a fierce advocate for us. And I love that fierce bit, because that's what they want us to be. We want you not to speak on our behalf, because we've got our own voice, but we want you to amplify our voice, and we want you to be fierce about that. And that's reframing for me.
That's a great definition of allyship, isn't it? Amazing, thank you. David?
So I'll be brief. I'm really enjoying hearing the rest of the panel here too.
Yeah.
But I think there's something about reframing risk, the risk of inaction that we've spoken about. Reframing accountability. We look up too much, and actually looking down to the people that we're really here to serve. I mean, we're too going through a strategy renewal process at the moment, and we'd love to hear ideas for actually where we've got it right, what are we building on, where do we need to get better. This point about experts has really come through, Junior, and I think we need to be much better as an organisation. I think many foundations here too could be bolder about bringing expertise into our organisations to challenge, disrupt. What's the next 10 years that moves us on from participatory grant making from lived experience into actually bolder, different, more courageous, more imaginative ways of working.
Amazing, thank you very much. Right, we're going to move to our second question, and this one was for Róísín and Danny, so we'll do it in that order if that's okay. And I'm sorry I didn't write your name down, but it was the woman from Glasgow who was asking about, she said, we've done a lot of talking about the how of grant making, but we haven't said, how do you ensure that the what achieves the end goals you're setting out to do? So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, Róísín and Danny.
Well, I think we've had some learning through the Peace Impact Programme, which we've been running for a number of years now. And I think it's very hard sometimes to demonstrate that impact. You know, what does it mean? You know, you can say, well, there's less riot and there's more peace, or we still have peace in Northern Ireland, though we have still communities who feel their cultural identities have been eroded, or they feel excluded from decision making or big parts of Northern Ireland policy. So for us, I think it's very much coming back to those people that are on the ground, and keeping a very, very relational partnership with them to hear, because they're very open and honest. Sometimes it's difficult to hear, but that's what you need to hear about what's the difference this money's making. Because particularly if you look at peace building in particular, and I'll speak about that, it's very much often it goes on over here, and you know it's quiet, and but it's critical. It's really what's needed, and we can show the impact because of when we're talking to people and we're sort of getting that feedback from. But I think, you know, if we're going to look at types of funding, there's people, as you said, very, very, very articulately, Junior, about, you know, we're doing a programme about homelessness and housing. You know, you have to have people who have been through that to understand what's going to have the most impact. Because we could sit here and come up with great ideas, but if you're not having the impact that's wanted by the community, that's needed by the community, and particularly in Northern Ireland too, we have two main communities, but there is emerging communities, and I'm constantly trying to tell people when they talk about, because when you get any debate in Northern Ireland, you talk about the two communities. I'm going, can we stop talking about the two? Can we talk about the emerging, and can we talk about how that's changing? And that's a big thing for us. That's a big challenge for us in Northern Ireland. But what that means, what's the impact we're having on those communities? Do they feel forgotten because they don't come from either the Protestant or the Catholic communities? And therefore we need to get better, and I think this is my challenge, we need to get better at asking people within those communities what's going to be the biggest impact in your life. What do you need? Whether you're asylum seeker coming into Northern Ireland, whether you've grown up there and you still feel excluded. And I think we haven't got it sussed by any matters of means, but I think for me it's about trying to get people who know what they're talking about to actually try to have honest conversations, to try and see what the impact and how we measure that, and that's a difficult thing to do. But just to keep on trying our very best to sort of have those open and honest conversations.
Thank you very much. Danny, what would you add?
Three whats, I think, that are top of mind for me anyway. One is, you know, it was abundantly clear so far this morning that, you know, given the multiple crises we face, we, especially those people in the room, in this room, have an extra responsibility to back ideas, individuals, institutions that have a chance of delivering a radically better world, right? And I think that's one what that we have to really sort of ask ourselves. Are we doing enough to back the ideas, the individuals and institutions that will deliver a radically better world given all that we face? Because the days of incremental change, the days of a few band-aids here or there are gone. And I think if we don't step up to the plate on that bit of the what, and that will differ from each of our own organizations and us as individuals, but I think that's one thing we have to, are we backing that? Second is, there's a sort of meta what around a vibrant, diverse civil society. I hope some of you will have seen research from Civicus, where I used to work, called the Civicus Monitor, that looks at civic freedoms around the world. And it's horrendous reading. Only 3% of people on the planet live in a country where civic space is genuinely open. And we live in the UK, in a country where things are going backwards. We're one of more than 100 countries in the world where Civicus thinks that conditions for civil society, the freedom of assembly, association, expression, are being hampered. And we are sleepwalking into a situation where the fundamental rights that we have taken for granted are under threat. And so the second what is, what are we doing to build resilience, to protect diverse voices, to protect radical voices who can challenge power? And the third what, and this is probably most relevant for anyone associated with private philanthropy, and I know community foundations or the National Lottery, for example, don't count in this category, and that's re-establishing the credibility of a bit of society that is deeply flawed. You know, we are also sleepwalking into an inequality crisis. There's a new billionaire being created almost every day around the world. So you might think private philanthropy is a boom business, but it's also a symptom of a deeply flawed global economy. And those of us who have the privilege of spending some of those resources from private philanthropy, I think, are also in the business of re-establishing the credibility of that, of justifying that those precious resources are worth the exclusion, the pain, the inequality that they were probably fueling in the accumulation of that private wealth.
Great, thank you very much, Danny. And then finally, our first question was about hard issues. And I'm going to start, if I might, with you, David, and I'll ask you to, use the brave space that Carol talked to us about to talk about things that might be uncomfortable, because we think we all need to face those.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll reflect on a few from the community fund. So I think there's one thing about capturing the opportunity to make change, and during COVID, we did that by, in one way, putting our reach and diversity data right at the front of our processes when we're making choices at portfolio and at project level about our diversity. Now, that may seem long overdue. It may also seem something that is a small and simple measure, but that did a few things. It drove behaviour by saying we measure this and that's why it matters, and sent some signals inside our organisation, and it actually driven some faster progress than we've seen in recent years inside the community fund in reaching communities that we have historically not served well enough. Now, we've got a lot more to do, but there's something about using those moments that you have to create change and actually finding even the small steps that will actually unlock something that might be bigger in there. I suppose the other thing that I reflect on a bit as a community fund, and in many of us in leadership roles, is about how we recognise and hold the tensions that we're carrying, and we're carrying them all the time, and almost by bringing them out, talking about them inside groups like this, inside our organisations. There's something that helps you as a leader, but it also helps us all navigate through some of those. So, some of those inside the community fund are about what do we fund now? We're seeing huge demands, food banks, crisis services. At the same time, we've also got this privilege and a responsibility to fund for the long term, to think about actually how are we going to solve some of these bigger questions that we have, the opportunity for young people in our society today, the climate crisis that we're facing. And that's a tension for us about our balance between being responsive and us being strategic as a funder. Our funding can't go everywhere. We're a large community funder. We distribute £600 million a year. That sounds a huge amount of funding. Well, you divide that by the number of people living in the UK, we distribute about £8 per person every year. Government services, on average, delivering something like £14,000 of government funding per person in the UK. So you've got to be really clear about the additionality that we bring, about holding the tension of that sort of responsibility we feel to make the difference in the areas that we care about, while also recognising the part that we can uniquely play inside that system. And I just also wanted to go back to the point about, we heard earlier about, it's all about our people and our organisations, and I think that's now more true than ever. Of course, it has always been. But we've got a massive responsibility to look out, support people inside our organisations, because it's actually through those that the change will really be made possible. And we've had lots of challenges that we've faced inside the community fund, inside many of our organisations in recent years. But how we step up to those, how we support others. I'm a big believer in a no-blame culture inside organisations. That's not about saying nobody's accountable or we can't learn and improve. It's about saying that human error occurs, right? And actually, it's only when we can all be humble and accept that we're making errors all the time, we're making errors in an organisation, you have a more permissive culture to be able to learn, improve, grow as individuals and as an organisation.
Thank you very much, David. Róísín, what's your hard issue?
For me, there's two main hard issues. One is the money that we receive, whether that's through private philanthropists, whether it's through government. How happy are we to challenge that? How happy are we to change it? How happy are we to criticise it when we need to, whether that's privately or publicly? How much are we willing to do that? Because I think we have to. The second thing is, and I'm just going to say as somebody who worked in the sector for a long time, is we need to pay people who work in the sector better. We need to give them better terms and conditions, or else we're not going to recruit people into the sector. Nobody comes into the sector to make lots of money, unless you know something I don't know in this room. You don't. And you don't come in for the kudos, you come in because you're passionate about making change. We cannot just take it as a given, and we cannot pay people less than what they get in the public or private sector with less good terms and conditions, because we will lose people, which we are. We will find it hard to recruit people, which we are, and we'll hard to find the next young leaders that are going to take the sector into the next millennium, into the next whatever we're going to go. And I think we definitely have to think about that, because we have to build it into our grant giving to make sure that we ensure that the organisations we give to pay their decent salaries to their staff and decent terms and conditions. And we have to look to our own staff and make sure that we treat them, because people are knackered. I don't know about you in the room, but people are knackered. They've come through the pandemic, they stepped up. Government will again expect us to step up in the cost of living, because that's what the government does, and we cannot do that with a workforce that is knackered. We can't do it. So we have to really, really, really push for us to pay decent salaries and decent terms and conditions to staff.
Brilliant, thank you. Junior, over to you.
I couldn't sit here and not talk about the role of race within the arenas of the charity sector, and how, if we're talking about big picture challenges, in the post-George Floyd era, there were loads of people saying, we want to promote people up, but I sat down with clients, and he said, honestly, I'll never forget, this kid said to me, show me how much of Nike and Reebok have promoted people from our communities to senior positions of leadership. And do you know what? We went through about 20 or 30 companies and we couldn't find one. Okay, it's really important. I'll tell you why, because we've got, as adults of this world, we've got to lead by example. And there's a disproportionality in terms of the issues that we're facing and the demographics that we're actually reaching, and then the actual amount of those people from those communities, and I'm talking not just BAME communities, but deprived communities, marginalised communities that are actually reaching the levels of senior positions. And it's important because we need the next generations to see that it is possible. And in terms of competition, again, like I was saying about the families that have lost their children, they're just not even in the race to start with. They haven't got the means to get to the starting line, to be on the same position as everyone else. And the problem with that is then we end up with the same same organisations with the same tired solutions and no innovation. And that's what we need to change. We need to change the blueprint of it. Because like, people have asked me, like, how do we get more people like you in roles of but actually it starts with the DNA of an organisation to even start looking in that way. We're talking about Pacific funds, we're talking about actually being able to build people that may not have the skills to set up the charity or have got achieved the level of marginalisation where they can't compete, to have the organisations that will partner with them so that we can have innovation start at the grassroots and build its way up. I think that's the big challenge.
Thank you very much, Junior. Danny?
Just to build on Junior's point around diversity and inclusion in our workforce, in our approach is really important. I think it's also important for some institutions where it's relevant to just be sure about your past. I'm a trustee at the Guys and St Thomas's Foundation. We've been undertaking a very important study looking at the heritage of our endowment and the role that the slave trade and the proceeds from it played. And I know several other private foundations and endowed institutions are doing that. That's going to be a critical step in also confronting some of the injustices of the past and hopefully reframing our responsibility for today as well around them. But the other bit that I found, I would just coming back to the personal, is, and perhaps this is also about reframing, which is a quote that has stuck with me ever since I've heard it, is from an Australian Aboriginal academic and activist called Lilla Watson, who said, "If you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you're here because your liberation is tied up with my liberation, let's work together." And for me, one of the most difficult aspects of my own personal journey is confronting my own heroism or saviour complex or whatever it is, and my own privilege, and coming to terms with the fact that I'm in this sector, I'm in the work that I do, because it is part of my own liberation. And I genuinely, want to work together in solidarity with the people and partners that we work alongside. And it's really difficult and it's counterintuitive, and our entire sector has been built on this sort of very traditional classic notions of charity and philanthropy. And for us to have any chance of thriving in the future, let alone sort of addressing the deep inequities and injustices we face, I think we have to start from that point of what does mutual liberation mean.
And that's a great place to leave it, I think. Amazing.